Well, it's that time of the evening where we look at your political stories of the day. Well, tonight you're not hearing from just the political desk. We've got some analysts lined up to also speak about the day's developments. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa earlier giving the closing address following this weekend's ANC NEC meeting. The party had a lot on its plate, including talks on the state of the organization, the contentious step-aside resolution, and Secretary-General Ace Magashule's fate. The NEC heard claims that the party is on the verge of collapse due to the implementation of the step-aside resolution. A suspended Magashule was removed from the virtual meeting. While Newsroom Africa's politics editor Bungalwa joins me as we talk to political analyst Dr. Sipho Siepe and Sanusha Naidu. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this discussion. Sipho, we had the opportunity of speaking a little earlier, so I'm going to give the first word to our analysts. Sanusha, perhaps let me begin with you. Your own impressions of this afternoon's brief by the President of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa.
Good evening, Kathy and Susubu and Prof. I think it was a kind of statement that he delivered where he needed to show that he was resolute, that the decisions that came out of the meeting, despite what we saw happening in terms of the kind of chaoticness and disarray that tended to underpin questions about leaked audios and stuff like that there. I think what they came up with eventually was, for the better part, a cohesive statement, a statement that said that the NEC had prevailed, that this was the majority consensus, and he presented it. I think it also was a matter of saying to people that these rules that we put into place, the step-aside rule, the rule around suspension, etc., we are clear about this. There's a coherence to it. Now, it doesn't mean that this is the end of days for these rules. I think what Ace Magashule did in the run-up to the weekend meeting was to essentially say, let me see how far I can go with the disarray, with the chaoticness, and how much I can push this NEC meeting into a complete breakdown of itself. If that was the intention, then I think that it was a limited success for him, because it didn't really pan out in that way. I think for those Ace Magashule voices on the NEC, the prevailing view was of the other two-thirds or even more than that prevailed at the end of the day. But I do think that there were elements in the statement, particularly where you heard the president talk about a public apology that the suspended SG needs to now make, in terms of the fact that he had no authority to issue his own suspension letter against the president. But I think it was also done in a manner to say, well, by your own hand, you went out and did this publicly. Now you'll have to basically apologize. I think what also became a bit concerning was the issue of the internal dynamics around the death threats, the way in which members' personal safety were put at risk, or there were other levels of unsavory action taken against or challenged against other NEC members, and in particular the fact that Jessie Duarte will be in that capacity as SG, that is her role. And more importantly, I think the fact that the president, I never heard this before, and Prof can definitely correct me on this, but I've never heard this before in an ANC statement where the president said there were well orchestrated forces and groups that had resources to sow the divisions within the party. I think for me that was a very interesting point, because this has never been something that has come out so kind of explicitly in a public statement. Always the ANC keeps things in-house. It has to be dealt with in-house. It's never to be dealt with on the outside. And I think he tried to do that in saying that, you know, we are in control. There is a sense of delivering. We know that there are problems, but to create that kind of coherence, I think the party this time around, by acknowledging those internal dynamics and issues of what was going on, I think is an admission of how deep these factional battles are, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Professor Siepe?
Well, what we should always expect is that whenever the ANC meet, it doesn't matter how difficult issues are and how much they differ. The organization understands that it has a responsibility to show a sense of unity and coherence. And in this case, the president sought to portray that element. But the people know that this is not the first time that the ANC has faced these difficulties. But in the end, even in their own way, they always say, after a lot of internal dynamics in fighting, we always come out. And that's very important from any organization. You cannot have a president giving a speech that continues to show the disarray that we were, because of the media and the platform, we were part of, in a sense that we had what was raised. But what is most important is, despite this show of unity and coherence, there are issues that the president had to acknowledge. Those that were also raised by the former president when he tried to summarize what came out, and where he singled out the submission of people who were actually saying the organization is about to collapse, and taking into consideration the notion that a retreat will be there to deal with these dynamics. So you have an organization that says, we are not going to ignore these submissions, and hence the idea of a retreat to discuss these internal dynamics was agreed to. But what is also important that emerges out of this is that despite the confidence that the Secretary General of the ANC had, what came out, but he always knew that he does not have the numbers. But what came out was whether the suspension will hold. And there were some people who were in the media space suggesting that Jesse Duarte had no authority to write that statement. But what is most important is not so much that the authority did not come from here. The authority started first with the resolution in Nasrec, where despite the modification of that resolution, but there was a position that when people are accused or reported to be involved in corrupt practices, they need to step aside or be suspended. So despite the fact that there's that modification, that suspension does not come with Jesse Duarte. It starts first with Nasrec resolution, then it went to the NEC of the ANC, and then was confirmed by NWC. And one must also point out that Magashule was part of that agreement, hence he was given 30 days. And once you had accepted and you are now going to consult, you have already lost the battle, in a sense that the step aside has been accepted, or failing which you'll be suspended. So it was just a matter of time. So what came out was simply that which Magashule feared, that you don't have the numbers. And I think for some people, the fact that he decided to suspend the president, that is very serious, because one must understand that in politics, you need to win the sympathy of many people. We remember at any time in the past, when Thabo Mbeki was removed, there had to be consensus within the NEC of the ANC, and the members had to be consulted, and the opinion had to be canvassed. Then you have a president removed. But it doesn't come from an individual. The same applies to the former president, Jacob Zuma. When the NEC decided that he must go, there was a canvassing, and that position was taken by a collective. So for one person like the Secretary General to simply assume that position as an individual without canvassing that support, it was always not going to work. So we saw that as simply what you would say that he needed to show and to raise issues. But those issues were taken up by some people who support him. But there were issues that were very clear that we were aware of that suggest that there is a problem within the ANC, and the ANC acknowledges that.
Now, Prof, I mean, given the fact that he's been asked to publicly apologize, and given his defiant stance that we saw over the past few days, if you're his political strategist, how would you advise Ace Magashule over the next few days and weeks in terms of how we should proceed?
You see, when you don't have the numbers on your side, politically you need to retreat. And we also know that if it does not retreat, you face the possibility where you might actually be expelled from the organization. So if you remain in the organization, you still have another day to fight if you feel that you've been hard done by. But what you cannot do is to continue to show defiance. So as a member of the ANC who wants to remain in the ANC and who understands that another day is possible, that the branches on the ground are calling for the NGC, you'd rather leave that to the branches. You'd rather say to the ANC that I'm going to stay. And I think if I were to advise him, he needs to apologize. There's nothing wrong in a retreat and remaining in the organization. There are people who refused in the past to apologize. Take somebody like Olomisa. He decided to go out. And I don't think there's been much political fortune that emerged out of that stance. So you saw some people who went to form COPE. Even those, they were defiant. But in the end, you find yourself really not the brand, the ANC brand still remains very strong. Sure. And you are better in the ANC for people like Magashule to play in that space so that you can continue to influence the world. But when you look at the conditions as well, this is something that if you read them carefully, this was paralyzing everybody who was suspended, because you cannot speak, you cannot mobilize, you cannot engage politically. So that's the state of paralysis. What will be interesting, even if you retreat, is what do you do with your time?
All right. Now, Sanusha, I mean, the issue of a retreat that the ANC will be going on, I mean, it sounds like to someone like a luxurious outing, but really, is this, what purpose do you think this retreat they're talking about will achieve? Given that, or is it another instance of the ANC trying to look for solutions when it knows the problems, or is there something effective that we can expect out of this retreat? How do you see it?
You know, it's a difficult one, Sibu, because when I get the sense that the retreat that they are talking about is to actually iron out some of these questions about the kind of cadres you want in the organization, dealing with issues around morality, ethics. What do you do in terms of a disciplinary framework, and also in terms of guidelines with regard to processes in terms of where you want to be as a party that's rejuvenating and in a state of renewal. I'm not 100% convinced that going out on a retreat is going to do that. I think what happens in a retreat is that you are now not necessarily in a virtual box, but you are now face to face, if that's the kind of retreat they're talking about. And that kind of retreat means that you end up in more consultation, and you end up in more senses of misunderstanding, but also you end up in more context of increasing crises. So it becomes a loop of crises upon crises upon crises. Whether or not this retreat is going in there with a set of documents that says, this is what our modus operandi is, these are our non-negotiable documents. Yes, we have discussed it. We will discuss it here. We'll negotiate it. But these are the broad frameworks, and this is what it's going to be like in terms of the kind of caliber, dealing with all of these cracks, dealing with questions of how audio sound and people's statements to the NEC got leaked through audio facilities. I think all of this needs to be looked at in a much more coherent way. But I'm a bit apprehensive, Sibu, because I think that at the end of the day, it becomes another talk shop. And when it becomes another talk shop, it just becomes another talk shop where we go into a spiral with the same old issues. I think there's a moment here for the NEC to use the opportunity when you look at the guidelines that they are drawing up for candidates to be on the local government list. I think it's an opportunity there to make those guidelines much more effective, expansive, and stringent in terms of what are the do's and the don'ts. I'm not saying the organization doesn't have it, but I think over time, the whole process of going through consultative mechanisms has meant that you end up in a situation where when you end up here where somebody says, I don't take your rules. I don't think your rules apply to me. I think your rules are very opaque. I think your rules are essentially just very caught in a gray area. So I think that is why these rules have to be really clear, coherent, and applicable and implementable, and not necessarily leave a lot of gray areas out. But I think at the end of the day, another retreat doesn't necessarily resolve the issues. I wouldn't like to think that I'm being dismissive of it, because I think it's not going to happen. But it's just another area to talk, a talk shop where we don't see what comes out of that. And I hope that this won't become a kind of a kickback to the old days where you just talk yourself into death.
Political analysts Professor Sipho Siepe and Sanusha Naidu, including our politics editors Bungalwa. Let's leave it there for tonight.